So when I accepted this invitation, I was very flattered, and I thought about what it means to tell a story about meetings with strangers, and I was sort of nervous because telling a story about a meeting with a stranger meant telling a story about what happened to me in my one body once in one kind of narrative, because that's what a story, especially a nonfiction story, is. And one of the reasons that I like poetry so much, is this? No, it stays here, doesn't it? One of the reasons that I like poetry so much, one of the reasons I've devoted so much of my energy to either writing poetry or helping people read poetry that I didn't write, is that poetry gives you a way to meet strangers, a way to present yourself to strangers and to enter into the consciousness of other people, other writers, other characters, that is not about having one story, one narrative, and one body. It's about meeting people through their words instead of through their bodies and faces. And then I thought, well, maybe I can tell a story about that, about the way that poetry works and doesn't work to introduce you to strangers, and about the difference between meeting someone through their poetry and actually meeting someone you haven't met before. And there are a lot of reasons why I like that view of poetry. Other critics have other views and other reasons for liking it. There are a lot of reasons I like it, but one is that, as you've just heard, I have more than one gender. I often feel like a girl inside. I sometimes wish I were, but feel like I'm not. It's a thing. I certainly identify as transgender. I go by Steph now by choice, although people call me other names sometimes, and that's okay with me, and I'm lucky to be able to be really out about that and to be able to write about it and present as the person I want to be a lot of the time. That was not always the case in the 90s. In the early 90s, when I was starting to figure this stuff out, there were models for what a trans person was like, and I felt like none of them applied to me. And, you know, I wore dresses to parties, and I wrote various poems with various personae. And then I kind of got a great academic job, my first professor job, and I moved to Minnesota, and I thought maybe, and I didn't get to go to the parties I was going to because I lived in Minnesota. I went to, I had other friends. Minnesota's a great place to live. We had a great social group, but it wasn't quite as queer, and it wasn't quite as stay out all night as my friends in the 90s had been. And I thought, maybe I don't need to express this quite as much. Maybe I can put my girl self in the fridge for a bit and be a grown-up and do other things. And I did, and it was really great for a while. And I got a great deal of stability and security, and we started a family, and it was fine for a while. And then around about 2011, it wasn't fine anymore. And I decided to start writing about my gender identity and to start presenting myself as who I am, and started going to conventions and meetings and events where I would meet strangers who were out as trans in various ways of being trans, and got from helpful strangers things like makeup tips, which I still value, and tips on how to dress better for the body that I have and the body I want to have, which I'm still collecting, so thank you. And a whole bunch of writings by me or about me came out that had to do with, pun I guess intended, my coming out. There was, for instance, a piece in the New York Times in 2012 by the terrific journalist Mark Oppenheimer that profiled me as poetry's cross-dressing kingmaker. That was the subhead. And, we have some problems with cross-dressing as a label because it implies it's all about clothes. It's not. It's about who I am. And it implies that it's a fetish, which I guess for some people it is, but that's not me. But it's not totally wrong. And Kingmaker seems so flattering as to be inaccurate, but I do write book reviews that apparently some people care about, and they're certainly about poetry. So there I was in the New York Times Magazine in 2012 as poetry's cross-dressing Kingmaker, and I liked the attention. It was very flattering, and it meant that after that piece came out, I would do a literary event. And people would not be shocked, or I'd go to a party and people who knew me as a poet and critic would not be stunned or confused if I showed up at, in a dress with makeup feeling the way that I feel inside. And other parts of my life, people who maybe aren't in the poetry world, people who, for example, I know because they're, the parents of my kids' friends and such, might still be shocked. And I still live with two genders. I present in different ways in different places, but nothing's a secret anymore. And that's really great. It's really great not to have secrets about who I am. And shortly after I finished coming out to the literary world as poetry's cross-dressing kingmaker, I had a set of poems in a very important anthology called Troubling the Line, edited by Trace Peterson and T.C. Tallbearer, whose work I encourage you to read. And that great big orange and black book is apparently the first anthology of trans and genderqueer poetry. And I was very happy to be included in that. And a little after that came out, I had my most recent full-length book of poems, which is called Belmont, after the terrific little town outside Boston where we live. And most of those poems had been written a little bit earlier, and it's got a whole bunch of stuff in it, including poems about gender and Avril Lavigne and Kermit the Frog and a talking stapler. But it's mostly a book about suburban parenthood, about living in a privileged town and figuring out what to do when your kids get boo-boos and being a grown-up. So that was Belmont. That came out in 2013. And this was the first of the books of my own poetry that I'd written that really ended up with something like a book tour. And I was a little ambivalent about a book tour because my kids are 6 and 10 now. At the time, if you can do the math, that meant that they were, 3 and 7. And it was the longest I'd been away from my 3-year-old, but my wife and I talked about whether to do this, and the answer was yes, go do this. Go visit some colleges and bookstores in another part of the country and see if they want to read your book. It was very flattering. It was a little uncomfortable, but mostly it was exciting. And so I got on a plane after Belmont came out and did a book tour of the Pacific Northwest. And the first stop, the first place I met some strangers, was at the Open Book bookstore, which is one of the few stores in the country that's all poetry in Seattle. Long, brightly lit, white, beautifully curated space. And I wasn't wearing this dress, but I had a black dress I had bought for the occasion, and at the time I was doing wigs. I do hats and not wigs right now, but I had this sort of black wig that gave me long hair that I don't really have naturally, and I spent quite a while getting ready to do this poetry reading, and it went pretty well. And the few dozen people who'd come to hear me read poetry who looked like they went to poetry readings all the time, who seemed happy with it, and some of them even bought my book, and some of them bought other people's books and chapbooks, which was exciting. I felt I was supporting the bookstore. And two ladies who were probably past retirement age, who had been sort of in the back, came up to me at the end of the reading and said, "I don't know if you remember us," one of them said, "but I'm Diane, and this is Connie." And Diane and Connie had been my 5th grade homeroom teacher and my 3rd grade science teacher. And, I'm one of those, I suppose, uncommon people who liked high school a lot more than I liked grade school for a number of reasons. I was not a terribly happy or fun kid to teach. I think in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, I wanted to be a girl and I didn't tell anyone, and I just had trouble talking to other kids, and I just wanted to sort of make up chemistry problems for myself all the time when I wasn't trying to be a science fiction writer. And Connie, the 3rd grade science teacher, was great about this, and I have wonderful memories of her giving me periodic table things. And sort of fossil guides, and Diane remembered, and I hadn't remembered this at all, that for most of 5th grade I had one shoe on her desk, and I would go around shoeless because I was constantly losing pens and pencils and constantly saying, "Can I borrow a pen?" And the only way she would lend me pens after a while would be if I gave up my shoe to her so I wouldn't run off with yet more pens that belonged to the school. So this was a meeting, and Connie and Diane had moved across the country from D.C. to Washington State for the outdoors. and saw my name in, I guess, the local Alterna Weekly or the Seattle Times, and just said, why don't we go and see them? So that's a meeting with strangers where I turned out not to be the stranger at all, and it established for me how continuous I still was with the person I'd been, even though I'd gone through all of these changes. But that wasn't the meeting with strangers that really taught me how poetry works. That was the next day. Because I woke up the next day in the hotel in Seattle, and I was going to read in Bellingham, Washington, that night at Western Washington University. And at the time, it took me quite a while to do my makeup and to figure out how to sort of present myself as a girl or as a woman. And I thought, do I really want to do this just to walk around Seattle and then get in a car? Can I change later? Is it really worth it? And I decided it wasn't. So I got up and I threw on a t-shirt and jeans and went to the Seattle Art Museum, which I recommend, and went thrifting on Seattle's Capitol Hill. And it takes me quite a while to go shopping because I don't trust my tastes. It's often said more than once that people with my kind of life story often dress wildly too young for ourselves and end up sort of accidentally looking like Hannah Montana. Unless we check with, there are people who want to look like Hannah Montana, or Avril Lavigne, but it's hard to pull off, right? So I take a long time thrifting or shopping when I'm by myself because I second guess myself, and I must have spent an hour and a half in the Goodwills and the Buffalo exchanges of Seattle's Capitol Hill, and I came away with my favorite pair of gray jeans. They're still my favorite pair, the Guess jeans, the kind that were really cool in 5th grade. And I realized after I'd made my purchase I was super late for Bellingham. So I got in the car, the rented blue Honda, and just booked it up I-5, past the greens and the grays of the evergreen state and around the highways and into the 75 zone. I was going 75 and I was going 80 and I was going 81 because I really wanted not to be late for my reading. And I saw amid the grays and greens, orange, red in the rearview mirror and heard woo, woo, and of course, it was a state trooper who pulled me over. And I was very polite and said, in my t-shirt and jeans, a very sort of normal-looking, I don't want to be late to give a reading to meet students at the local public university. I was in a hurry. I'm sorry, officer. I'll do a better job. And he said, do you know that this is a 65 zone? You were going 16 miles an hour over the speed limit. And then he wrote me a warning. He was very sympathetic. So I got to Bellingham. And I should tell you just for a bit, they've got quite a good creative writing program at Western Washington University. They have Oliver de la Paz, who is a significant poet and sort of writing program organizer. They have Carol Guest, who's a great flash fiction, prose poem writer, who also teaches their queer lit class. They have the essayist and memoirist Suzanne Paula, and they have the poet Bruce Beasley, who had invited me, and who writes very elaborate, thoughtful, somewhat traditional in some ways, poems that are engaged with early 20th century and sort of 17th century religious thought. His last book's called Theophobia. And I figured that his students were reading Belmont in their poetry writing class, and I was all ready to meet them. But I got to his house and Suzanne's house, and I was sort of exhausted and traumatized. I'd just been pulled over for driving too fast on a highway that I was unfamiliar with, and just kind of sat on their couch and did nothing for half an hour, which was very refreshing and restorative. And then they took me to the auditorium and told me about Bellingham and told me things I didn't know. I don't know, have anyone been to Bellingham, Washington here? No. No, right. Anyone been to Seattle? No. Right. So I knew Seattle was what I expected. Bellingham was not. Bellingham is famous in industrial history for union stuff, for port stuff, and there's still stuff having to do with, I think, gas pipelines going on in Bellingham. But it also turns out to have a hippie town component, kind of like Asheville, North Carolina, or Woodstock, New York. And so kids, sort of lefty kids, alternate kids, who are choosing among public universities in that part of the country often choose Western Washington. It's more, in other words, like Olympia, as well as more like Asheville, say, than I thought. And I saw that as I saw some of the kids who were there. And had a wonderful short conversation about teaching queer lit with Carol Guest, G-U-E-S-S, read her work, and got into the auditorium, and there were the students, a few dozen students, and I was happy to see them, but they looked a little bit disappointed to see me, or at least that was the vibe I got, that was what I thought, and I was thinking, how can they be disappointed? before I've even started to read. And this may be my take on them based on what I was about to learn. But it was the way that the vibe in the room seemed. And if you're a lecturer or a performer, you may have seen this yourself. And I was thinking, why are they disappointed? And then I saw what books they were holding and what books they were carrying. And it turned out that the students who were reading my work, which was one of the reasons that they had bothered to bring me across the country to read at Western Washington University, they weren't necessarily reading Belmont, my new book about suburban parenthood. They were reading Troubling the Line, the first anthology of trans and genderqueer poetry. And they had hoped and expected to meet poetry's cross-dressing kingmaker. And I had shown up, and I was just in a t-shirt and jeans, having just gotten out of the car. And I felt I had let them down. And I felt better after the reading and talk and Q&A, and I met and talked to some of the students, and we talked about how I present myself and how we all present ourselves differently in different spaces. But that was a lesson. It was also a chance to get a really cool scarf. It was a chance to get this scarf. These students, Carol's students, had teamed up to buy me what I think was a locally made scarf. This scarf, which is still my favorite scarf. So thank you to Western Washington University's students for reading Troubling the Line and for picking up the scarf. But the lesson I got from that was really that you can write poems in which you can have all sorts of faces and characters. You can write a poem as a stapler, as a frog, as a girl, as a woman, as a boy, as a man, as a talking block of ice. And I've done all those things, but if you're going to meet strangers in person, you can only be one person at one time. Thanks.